Welcome to the third session of the course, Peace and Non-Killing in Virtual Religion. My name is Katyayani Singh and I have with me Professor Dr. Thomas Stafford. He would be taking this session wherein we would be discussing about the monotheistic religions, that is Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and also Zoroastrianism. Previously, we have discussed the concept and ideology of non-killing. Also, we have taken up the pagan religion in the second lecture series of ours. So, in this lecture, in the certificate course, what we really want to focus about is how to propagate the ideology of non-killing in the world. What does the non-killing ideology specifically means, and what role the different and diverse religions can play in this. So, for today, Dr. Thomas would be teaching us about the monotheistic religions, the practices they follow, how they contribute to a non-killing society. And for this purpose, now I would like to now hand over the mic to Dr. Thomas. So, Dr. Thomas, if you may please like to start.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Singh. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a very important topic, just to say that, you know, in the history of the world, so many wars have taken place with religious justifications or explanations. And the history of humanity is a history of these kind of ideologically fueled religious wars. And so we're trying to get to the nub of that in this course, to try and find why it is that religion, which is supposed to be about peace, has often ended up being about killing. And both sides are in human nature. We have a sort of double nature, human beings. We can all be murderers and killers if we're pushed to the limit, you know, if our children are threatened, if our house is invaded, etc., etc. But our natural instinct is more peaceful. So what's going wrong? What's gone wrong in history? We looked last session at the pagan religions, the primordial ones from primal times. And we learned that they have many wonderful features. They've invented many things. The ancient Egyptians invented writing, the Babylonians did, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Indians, the Hindus, invented incredible culture and civilization in the Indus Valley and in the rest of India. And yet they also had this warlike nature. They all used to fight among each other and against others. And some even did, you know, things like, well, actually all engaged in certain forms of human sacrifice from time to time. I mean, war is essentially a sort of human sacrificial cult where you try and kill the enemy. And the Aztecs, as we learned in American Indian culture, were pretty upfront about that. They just killed their captives in sacrificial killings, which they said were dedicated to the sun god. So then God became a sort of justification for mass killing. And this was why in the Enlightenment period, some people said, well, we should just get rid of the idea of God altogether. It's dangerous. So it's a complex issue, this. And we're trying to approach this as scientists and as philosophers, trying to look at it from all perspectives. Now, one of the reforms, I think, you see, religion is not a static thing. The history of humanity is not a static thing. We evolve. Languages form, art changes, literature changes, culture changes, and religions change. And one of the great things about religions is you have these special kinds of priests or prophets come along from time to time. Hindus call them avatars. Buddhists call them Buddhas, or Tirthankaras for Jains. You know, there's always a new wave coming of teachers. And they try, I think, to advance humanity in the right direction. Seems to me they always speak about peace, they will speak about justice and truth and so on. And often the story is they're not listened to in their lifetimes, or there's a small group that listen to them. They're neglected, and they're often opposed, and violently so, because sociologically, it's been, you know, studied by scientists that any new ideas that threaten the existing power structure in the society are going to be opposed by the holders of power in that society. Obviously, it's kind of logical, because so they have to fight that, and then they have to fight the battle of ideas, because usually they're opposed by the prevailing religion or priesthood. When Buddha appeared, his ideas were opposed. People tried to kill him because they felt he was undermining their happy world view that the Hindu priests had at the time. Indra was in his heaven and everything's fine. Why are you causing trouble, Buddha? So, and that's typical. Everyone has to do that. So one of the great reforms that was, I think, proposed among these religious spiritual seers, let's call them the collective rishis of humanity, the seers of humanity, the religious geniuses, was, why don't we get across this idea there's only one God? Maybe the problem is because people think there are so many gods, that's why there's all this killing and fighting. It was a sort of idea, a reformer idea, that if we only had the one God, everyone accepted that, there's one absolute, then we would remove the cause or the reason for fighting among different religions, because we'd all follow the same God. So we couldn't kill each other on that justification. We might still kill each other for money, supplies, power, usual stuff, but not God. So I think that's what these monotheists thought. And, you know, it's sort of, the trouble is, of course, it hasn't quite worked, because what we've now got is rival gangs of rival monotheisms fighting on the planet, who are each paradoxically saying our God is the only God, the true God, and your God is a false God. And we've had these monotheistic wars going on for 2,000-3,000 years, in which the different monotheistic religions are fighting among themselves, and they're also fighting the pagans. So there's total mayhem going on in the sphere of religions. But let's just run through the story. Let's look first at Zoroastrianism, because this is a very ancient religion. The reformer here was called Zoroaster, and he lived in about 1750 BC in the frontiers of Afghanistan and northeastern Persia, around the town of Balkh, which in those days was a very interesting civilized culture. It was very ancient. It had, it worshipped a basic pagan religion, worshipped the elements of nature. It was very much like early Vedic Hinduism. And the language that Zoroaster spoke was like early Sanskrit. It was like a form of early Sanskrit. It's called the Avestan language. And he worshipped the elements of earth, air, fire, water. They were all holy to him. Nature is sacred, and cattle are sacred. It was an agricultural people. They had, like the early Vedic people, they had cows. They worshipped the life force that's within them all. And Zoroaster was a priest of that religion. So you could say, ironically, he was a sort of a Hindu, if you want, in his religious outlook. And if you put him down with a bunch of Hindu rishis in Rishikesh, they would have totally understood each other. But what Zoroaster said is he was a reformer, because he brought in two very important new ideas. He said, firstly, that although there are many spiritual forces, let's call them angels and archangels, devas, there's one overarching lord above them all, who is called by Zoroaster Ahura Mazda, which means the Lord of Wisdom. And he was symbolized in Zoroastrian ideas by a heart or a light surrounded by wings. He's the Lord of light and the creator of all that's good, creator of consciousness, creator of human beings, creator of the sun, the moon, the stars, the planet, each other, all the things we love. Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, has created. And as human beings, we're here to worship, give thanks, live lives of piety, righteousness, to follow good thought, good words, and good deeds, and to be as as kind and loving to our friends and neighbors as we can be. And the reason we have to do this is because when we die, we will be called to account. The soul lives on after death. If we act violently, if we kill without cause, if we terrorize, tell lies, etc., we will have to pay the penalty in the afterlife. And Zoroaster taught that there is an afterlife, and if you've been evil, you will be punished in the afterlife. And he went into some graphic detail, you know. Now, Zoroastrianism, the second reform that he brought in, if he just brought that in, I mean, that's a major reform, the idea there's one absolute God. Although I have to say other religions had kind of worked that out. The Hindus tended to think there was one absolute Lord. They disagreed over what they called it. Some said it was Indra, some said it was Brahma. Later on, some said it was Vishnu or Shiva. You know, there's still no agreement among Hindus as to who is the absolute one Lord. Although I suppose Hindu philosophers eventually decided it was the divine consciousness, the Brahman, the impersonal being, if you want. So Zoroaster brought another reform in that was also very important. He said that this good God, Ahura Mazda, was unfortunately engaged in a life and death struggle against an evil god. There's another, a devil figure in Zoroastrianism, who's called Angra Mainyu. And who's the force of everything that's evil? He creates killing. He gave mankind weapons. He creates false information on the internet. He created the lie. And the weapon that Angra Mainyu uses to destroy humanity, which is his goal, is lies, which is called the drudge. The lie is the weapon that Angra Mainyu uses to destroy Ahura Mazda's good creation. And it's been a fight even before this planet was created. Later, Zoroastrian philosophers looked at what's going on the planet and saw this eternal battle between good and evil. And they formulated what's called an eschatology, which means a sort of cosmic time scale, right? And the script goes as follows. This battle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu has been going on for billions and billions of years before planet Earth was even created, before humans came into being. There's no real consensus as to why. Why is there this force of evil in the cosmos? Why is there destruction and death and killing? They don't know really. They haven't been able to work that out. But it exists. And so this has been going on other planets, other civilizations, and eventually Ahura Mazda, the good Lord, created planet Earth to be the battleground of the final struggle between good and evil. He created us human beings to become good and to choose goodness and wisdom. If we do that, if this world can be turned to a place of light and truth, justice that we all want, the good ones among us, then Angra Mainyu will accept Ahura Mazda's lordship. He will surrender and stop trying to destroy the world or any other future worlds. He will admit defeat. And he himself will submit to the Lord of Wisdom. But it's, unfortunately, you know, it's an open season for this battle between good and evil on the planet. And as yet, there's no sign that the devil is completely surrendered yet, because we have World War II, we have the Holocaust, we have racial conflict, violence between religions. All this, according to Zoroastrianism, is, you know, the devil is very clever. He's infiltrated even religions to make it that even the people supposed to be good are actually doing evil. And if you think, well, no, science is the answer, well, the devil's got very clever because he's even infiltrated scientists who now publish false results, fake their results, practice a sort of scam of publishing each other's fake papers and so on. So science has become corrupt, and that's all the devil working away. So Zoroaster was faced with this problem. He said, there have to be we have to upgrade, like reboot humanity from time to time. And that's what Zoroaster was doing as a prophet. He brought this great teaching, which is when you learn it, if you become a pious Zoroastrian and you learn to follow the truth of Ahura Mazda and you swear an oath of fealty, then the devil can't get you. You become immune. And that's why this religion has lived on. And the Persian priests, the Magi, they're called, took refuge in India when Islam came. And they've lived there ever since as Parsis. There are Zoroastrian temples throughout that part of India. I've met many Zoroastrians. They're very good people. And they've played an important role in modern Indian culture. So, and their view is that Zoroaster was like a messiah figure, a prophet who brought wisdom to earth. He didn't finish the work because we still haven't defeated the devil. And there will come in the future, say the Zoroastrians, at some point, a figure called the Session3, who is going to revive truth and light and love on this planet and defeat the devil forever. That will be his final defeat. We don't know when he's coming. It could be now. It could be in 100 years, 200 years. It's sometime soon, quote unquote, whenever he's needed. And pious Zoroastrians are looking for that because we need backup. It's like the siege of the Libyan embassy, and there's only a few of us guarding the fort, so we need backup. Okay, that's the basic idea of Zoroastrianism. Now, it sounds interesting. It sounds plausible as a religion. The problem with it, there are several problems with it. Firstly, from being the ideas of a small little group of people in Balkh in Afghanistan, prophets there, it spread throughout Persia, and it became the religion of the Persian Empire under the great kings Darius and Xerxes. And then it was used by them in an imperialistic way in their conquests. The Persians then set off to conquer Greece and India and elsewhere. And at the front of their armies, they would shout and say, "We're fighting for the good God, Ahura Mazda. If you oppose us, you're the devil. You're fighting for Angramenu. So we're going to conquer you in the name of goodness. And if you join our religion, you can count as good people. You can become part of our empire. And the Shah will accept you as good people. If you fight us and oppose us, we'll conquer you and kill you because you're obviously working with the devil." So this religion was, I think, distorted and twisted by power, by the power structures of Persian militarism, which then conquered. It was the biggest empire the world had ever seen, right? And it did conquer parts of northern India, and it tried to conquer Greece, and it sent great armies under Xerxes. However, the plot didn't go very well because the Greeks said, "We don't accept your religion. We don't accept your right to conquer us. We don't accept your dualism." They called Zoroastrianism dualism and said, "No, we don't accept the world has got two deities, a good and a bad one. We think the world's got many more deities. It's got goddesses. It's got the goddess of love, Aphrodite. It's got the goddess of wisdom, Sophia. It's got Dionysus, who's the god of partying and ecstasy. We've got Demeter, who's the goddess of fertility and agriculture. We're not going to bow down and submit to your ideology, and so we're going to fight you." So the Greeks had a counter narrative, and the Greeks actually won, as in they defeated the Persian Empire, which was a fluke because they were very small in number compared to this vast empire. But they defeated them in a series of heroic battles, Marathon and Thermopylae and others. And then the Persians were defeated in turn by Alexander the Great. And the Greeks justified their killing of the Persians because the Persians had a false monotheism, they said. Okay, so it didn't really work out. The ideas of Zoroastrianism seemed great, but there were problems in how it was working out. I would say it's because not the problem of Zoroaster, I would say it was the way that they replied. Okay, so I'll rush on to the next religion now. Judaism, because I want to get those both done, and then we'll stop and have some discussion. I'm sure you'll have some questions for this. Okay, the next religion, Judaism, is again extremely interesting. A monotheistic faith. It was developed, according to the Bible, it was the original religion. It was developed by God in creating mankind, Adam and Eve, the archetypal parents of all humanity. And biblical studies as a field is very interesting. The writings in the Bible that describe creation and the story of God have been influenced both by Sumerian, Babylonian, and Mesopotamian religions that pre-existed. They've also been influenced a lot by Egyptian religion, which we looked at last time, because many of the great heroes of Judaism, Moses, Abraham, Jacob, and the others, they all spent a lot of time in Egypt. And different biblical scholars point to this and say, yes, this Bible thing, this is Egyptian religion repackaged for the Semitic people of Mesopotamia who were wandering about, with their camels, didn't really know what to worship. So they were inspired by these prophets coming out of Egypt, which was a much more sophisticated and evolved culture. And Egyptian religion had already developed the idea of monotheism, in fact, in the priesthood schools of Egypt. They'd worked out that, yes, there are all these different deities floating about, spirit beings, but there's got to be a divine consciousness beyond them all, which they called Thoth or Ptah. Again, different priesthoods called that different. Some called it Amun. They were the priests in Thebes. So biblical studies is really interesting. The question is looking into the history of Judaism, which it wasn't, that name Judaism is a much later term, just as Hinduism is a later term. The original rishis never went around saying, I'm a Hindu. They said, I follow the Sanatan Dharma. So the original Jews never went around saying, I'm a Jew. That's a later term that came up with Judah, who was one of the sons of Jacob, who lived many years after Moses and many years after Abraham. No, they went around saying, I follow the truth, I follow the light. So firstly, biblical studies have shown that Abraham is a key figure in this religious tradition. If you read the Bible, like historically and scientifically, you see that a lot of the biblical stories go back to the time of Abraham. Now, who was he? When did he live? Again, this is really interesting. It seems he lived almost exactly at the same time as Zoroaster, about 1750 BC. And he lived in northern Mesopotamia. When I was a boy, scholars used to say Abraham came from Ur. It's said in the Bible he comes from Ur, U-R. And everyone used to say this was down in the south of Iraq. There's a great city called Ur of the Chaldees. And there was a famous British archaeologist who discovered it and excavated, and they found tablets with writing on, many of which carry stories just like the Bible, especially Noah's flood and other stories. But later, there's been more recently, in the last 20 years, a consensus that the Ur that Abraham came from was up in the northern part of Mesopotamia, in a place which is now called Sanliurfa. It's a Turkish southeastern city. And historically, that's where the Muslims and Jews always used to say Abraham came from. They show the cave where he was born, Sanliurfa. And Maimonides, who's the greatest philosopher of Judaism and a great hero of mine, used to say that's where Abraham came from. So until I see, absolute evidence he came from Ur of the Chaldees in the south, I'm going to stick with Maimonides. To me, Abraham coming from Sanliurfa or Ur, it makes much more sense. One reason is that the Bible narrative tells us he came from Sanliurfa or Ur, but then he went to a place called Haran with his father, Terah, and his family. And Haran is only like 2 hours walk from Ur of the northern Ur. So the journey wasn't that difficult. It would have been a place to go to. And then after that, the fact that he goes to the Holy Land, Palestine, what becomes Judea or now Israel and Palestine, is just down the road. It's easy to these people didn't want to do vast journeys. They had their flocks, they had their sheep and goats. So coming from Haran to the Holy Land is feasible. Okay, so Abraham seems to have been a very clever chap. He was a typical boy, questioning his parents. How do you know there's all these gods and goddesses? The story says Terah was making statues for the temples. These people were very religious. Sanliurfa is near a site called Göbekli Tepe, which has just been discovered in the last 20 years and excavated. It's the oldest temple yet discovered on planet Earth. It dates back to at least 10,000 years BC. That's 12,000 years ago. And they found these pillars of stone embedded in this hillside in southeastern Turkey with all kinds of animal carvings on. And scientists are trying to decipher it. These people that made it were pre-Neolithic. They hadn't even got farming, but they somehow built these sanctuaries, religious temples, which are the oldest yet discovered. And it's just down the road from Ur. So these people, Abraham inherited 8,000 years of religiosity. The story is that he was of a more philosophical mind. He said to himself, there can't be all these different gods and goddesses. There has to be one overarching ruler of them all. Now, and he decided, therefore, he would worship and follow that one God. Now, if you decipher the stories in depth, who is this one God that he starts following? What's very interesting is the people of Sanliurfa and Haran actually worshipped the moon god, who was called Sin, S-I-N. They believed that the Sin deity was the absolute Lord of all creation and the Lord of time and the Lord of being. And my hypothesis is that Abraham was saying Sin, the moon god, is the absolute. And it's interesting that wherever this monotheistic idea of Judaism and Islam and Christianity spread, this moon god is secretly hiding away in the background. So anyway, scholars who, like me, that look into biblical studies, were still studying Abraham, the context. If I could interview him on a Zoom call, I'd ask him, was sin the one that gave you the real inspiration for this one God idea? And I think Abraham would say, actually, Thomas, I've got to confess, yeah, I'm secretly a sin worshipper, because he has all the qualities of God in Judaism. What about Moses? Because if you say Abraham is the first founder, both of Islam and of Judaism and Christianity, they all look back to Abraham as their founder, which is why it's so important to decide where he came from and what inspirations inspired him. But the second great founder of Judaism was Moses. And we've all heard of Moses. Now, he was another great religious leader, a prophet, a seer, who began his life in Egypt. And he was very influenced by Egyptian thought. He was taught in Egypt to read and write. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, it says in the Bible. So he would have learned the hieroglyphs. He would have been taught the Egyptian writing system and their religious texts and so on. Now, again, there's a lot of discussion about exactly when he lived. The chronology of Moses is constantly debated. There are thousands of articles in learned journals about when he lived. It used to be said he lived in about 1250 BC, so about 500 years after Abraham, and that he led a kind of resistance movement of Jews who escaped from Egypt and set up this new state, which they were eventually going to call Israel. He himself never entered it. He died on the way, but his lieutenant Joshua conquered this land, stole it from the Canaanites because God had promised it to them. and set up a state, dedicated to this one God. Now, some people believe that narrative still, and it, and follow it, and still use it as a sort of justification for the whole raison d'etre of certain forms of extremist Zionism, which is God gave us this land, therefore nobody else has the right to it. I've gone into this with enormous fine-tooth comb, and I've come to the view, as have many other scholars, that the dating of Moses is wrong. We have to push him back to about 1500 BC. And there's a fantastic documentary film made by James Cameron, who made the movie Titanic, which is one of the great epic movies, and Avatar. James Cameron is one of the greatest filmmakers. He teamed up with a Jewish scholar and archaeologist called Simcha Jakubowicz, and they produced a film called Exodus, which looks at all the latest archaeological evidence and when Moses lived. And they came to the view that there's pretty much proof that he lived about 1500 BC at the time of a pharaoh called Ahmose I. Now, this fits in with everything that actually real scholars have been saying for centuries, because at the time of Ahmose I, 1500, 1550 BC, the Semitic peoples from Canaan had conquered the northern part of Egypt, and they had their own capital there called Avaris. They were not particularly, welcomed by the Egyptians. They were regarded as invaders, which is what they were, but they'd been settled there for several hundred years. The Egyptians text called them the Hyksos, the shepherd people, because they all had like flocks and so on. They had a different way of life and a different language to the Egyptians. And Ahmose I was a hero to the Egyptians because he led the resistance movement, and he conquered and kicked out the Hyksos from Egypt. He defeated them in several battles. He captured Avaris, and he made them leave Egypt. Now, this is very interesting because it fits in with the Exodus story of Moses, but it tells it from the other side. From the Egyptian point of view, these interlopers, the Hyksos people, were actually invaders. So they had to be, eventually the hero Ahmose got rid of them, and they had to flee to Canaan and elsewhere. Now, it makes sense, and this is what this documentary film partly reveals, but I've gone into this. There are some archaeological and historical studies now. You see, the ancient classical scholars of Alexandria, when they were studying who are the Jews, their scholars, people like Manetho and others, said, well, they were the Hyksos people. They were forced out of Egypt, lost, and therefore they had to flee. And that was always the consensus among learned people in classical Greek and Roman times. So really, this suggestion that Moses lived in 1500 BC is in conformity to the consensus of all the great intellectuals that looked at this problem. Now, what's interesting, now let's get back to the God thing. If Moses was brought up at the court of Ahmose I, we know that Ahmose worshipped, again, the great moon god who was called Khonsu, Khonsu. He had a secret cult of Khonsu, who was the lord of intelligence. And he was also later called Thoth, who was the god of all wisdom, the god of teaching, the god of learning, the god of scribes. And Ahmose loved this god. And Moses, I think, was taught to love him too. And what's very interesting, the clincher, is that a secret name of this god, the moon god, was Yah, or Yahweh, which becomes the secret name that Moses takes into the desert. So my hypothesis here is that Moses was a priest of Khonsu, the moon god, Yahweh, who decided that Yahweh was the Lord of all history, the God of wisdom, and that he would create a people out of the scattered bands of Hyksos that were being expelled from Egypt. He would be purer even than the Egyptians. So he would out-Egyptian the Egyptians. It's not that he didn't like Egyptians, although he did kill one of them in anger. He felt that God was calling him as a prophet to create a new, better than the Egyptians, and he called them the Hebrews, or they became later the Jews, right? So anyway, that's a working hypothesis as to how Yahweh became the God of the Jews, and it became the chief God or the only God. However, many of the Jews, I think, didn't accept this reform. They still wanted to worship their goddess. They worshipped the Shekinah. God needs a goddess to do the work. And this was handed down orally in what's called the Kabbalah. Judaism is really interesting as a religion to study because it has the Bible text, but then it has an oral text which interprets it. And that's the Kabbalah. And I've studied both. I've been trained to know the written text, but the spoken text, the Kabbalah, tells the details. So Moses was also an expert in the Kabbalah, but he didn't really understand, perhaps the argument would go, the full significance of the Shekinah. He made his religious, his religion a bit fierce, especially for women, and for pagans, because to justify the conquest of Canaan, they had to really say, no, our Yahweh is totally different from you. We have the right to conquer you. Which, of course, is the argument of all religious imperialism. It's like the Christians going to North America and saying, we have the right to conquer you, Native American people, because you're primitives and our God is the only God. It's the old argument. And then Judaism has developed, obviously 3,000 years, well, that's 3,500 years since Moses' time. There have been huge changes. The Bible got to be written down eventually in this language called Hebrew, and scholars have been working, commenting on it, trying to understand it. The consensus is you don't have to read it literally. The Kabbalah teaches that you don't read the Bible literally like a story. It's the inner meaning of the words that matter, and you should study their inner allegorical message, if you want. And that's what Jewish philosophers have been doing ever since. It's a story of redemption of humanity from slavery, and towards freedom. And the idea of the one God is then therefore a symbol of our healing as humanity. The tragedy, of course, is that many people have hated the Jews throughout history. The persecutions they've suffered in classical times, the Romans conquered them, slaughtered them, crucified many of them, conquered Jerusalem. And then in medieval Europe, where they scattered, they were also being persecuted in pogroms. And then under Hitler, obviously in the Holocaust, they were slaughtered in their millions, because people didn't like their idea of the one God of history should have privileged them as the chosen people. Why would the one God of history? Let's just assume there is one God, and that's, I think, you'd have to argue that quite deeply. Why would the one God of history have chosen just one small tribe in the Middle East instead of choosing, say, a tribe in Orkney or Vancouver or the southern tip of India? Why just one tribe? And then why would he have given that one tribe the right to then conquer other people that don't agree with their religion? So there are problems. Now, Jewish philosophers have got round this by trying to explain it. I will just add one final thing as to my kind of attempt scientifically to make sense of this. I think the reason we have the Bible as the core religious text of, the Middle East and the Western world is because it's exactly where the alphabet was invented. At the time when Abraham lived, 1750 BC, was when the alphabet was being invented by the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. And therefore the medium of writing was now available. So those legends got written down. That's why we've heard of Adam and Eve and Abraham and Jacob and so on. If the alphabet had been invented in Indonesia at the same time, not in Palestine, then the Bible would have spread out from there with the stories of the Indonesian people, their creator God, their tribal wars. This is my argument. So it's a sort of scientific explanation for why the God of the Jews became so important and became, had the mass media attention for the last 3,000 years. I think I can prove that scientifically. There are various studies on the history of the alphabet. We know that's where it came from. So that's interesting because it means that Judaism is both an alphabetic script, but the Kabbalah says that God created the world through sound. In the beginning, he said, "Let there be light." And therefore, sound is the secret of the Kabbalah. And what the Kabbalah teaches is to analyze each word of the Bible into its sound, which then reveals a whole other level of meaning, its metaphysical meaning. So, for instance, take the first word of the Bible, Bereshith. It means in the beginning. And if you've read the Bible, that's what you start with. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, this word Bereshith in the Zohar, which is the Kabbalistic text, has 20 pages of commentary on that one word alone. Because Bereshith has a whole range of meanings in the sounds. And it doesn't mean in the beginning as in the beginning of time. It means somewhere now, at the source point of existence, now, the energy of consciousness is creating light, form, namarupa, that we experience. So that creation is continuous creation. And that divine mind is doing that creating right now. And 20 pages of commentary explain that in the Zohar. So that gives you a glimpse of there's different forms of Judaism. There's the Orthodox one in the synagogue, and then there's the scholars and philosophers one, which is called the Kabbalah, which means a transmission, by the way. Anyway, so there we are. That's the first two. They're complex. Both of them end up saying it is permissible to fight, to spread your religion, and to defend it. So when the Jewish army officer now in the Israeli Defense Force is recruited, he will fight the Palestinians or other terrorists, as they call them, because God gives him permission and a duty to do so. He believes he has a duty, as do Zoroastrians, although they don't, have a state, but they volunteer and fight in the Indian army and elsewhere, I'm sure. Okay, so that's the first two. Anyway, back to you, Katyeni. I hope that was of interest.
Indeed, Thomas, that was very interesting to know about the religion of Judaism as well as that of Zoroastrianism. So I just have this question. When it comes to Abraham, you talk that he was, there is a debate whether he is the founder of Judaism or Islam. I believe that's
Sure.
what you also pointed out. So, irrespective of the fact that which religion he founded, my question is, does his ideology involves participation in war, killing, or even for mass conversion? Because the story of these prophets basically goes like these people were involved in crusade wars, and many times they forcefully asked the people to convert the religion. And in case the people refused to convert, they were executed. So my question is, how far is it historically correct? In case, even if it's a myth, in case if it's even we treat that it's possibly was a myth, not something real. So should we look upon these prophets as leaders for the future? Should we have? There are a lot of religious obligations which people feel they have towards their religion, and owing to that, sometimes a lot of killings take place?
Mm. That's a very good question, and thanks for asking. Yes, the evidence shows that Abraham was also a warrior as well as a prophet. The biblical text tells us he led some small bands of fighting men. You know, they're called armies in the Bible, but these would have just been maybe 100 or 200 warriors, either on camels or horses or whatever, fighting other similar bands. Abraham wasn't a pacifist. He wasn't like Buddha or Mahavira teaching absolute consciousness transformation, enlightenment. No, he was teaching that his followers had the right to defend themselves against other people. And he joined a group of kings, they're called, but they were like warrior bands in a war against other similar warrior bands. So, and it would appear historically that that's probably true. You see, what happened, Abraham lived in, as I've said, about 1750 BC, and his people then, in those days, you were like a tribal desert leader, a patriarchal family structure with all your women and children in tents with flocks of animals. And you moved like a nomad. These were nomadic peoples. They weren't really into farming. They didn't want to settle. They traveled about. They tried to stay out of trouble, like camping on the edge of your valley or whatever. Just all they wanted was enough water for their flocks and enough grass to eat. But occasionally, of course, they'd meet trouble. The local people who lived in the houses of the towns would want to fight them. And so the Bible is full of these little skirmishes, these battles. Now you can say to me, oh, well, then that disproves Abraham. He wasn't a great prophet like Buddha or Mahavira. He wasn't on that level. Well, no, he wasn't. But this is the tragedy of history. This is history as we actually have it. As I've said, it's an accident that Abraham's stories got written down because the alphabet was invented. He wasn't the greatest prophet or teacher who ever lived. He just was the one on the block when the alphabet was invented. And think of it like if the alphabet had been invented in 20th century Los Angeles with all the gang warfare going on, they would have made a story about, you know, some gangster with his gang was better than all the others. But that it tells us the humanity behind the Bible. The God of Abraham is the God of humankind because we are killers, we are gangsters. You know, Buddha and Mahavira are on a totally different plane. You know, it's hard to reach that level of consciousness. You know, unless you're a philosopher. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Yes, indeed, indeed. So basically, I'm just trying to compare all the prophets, that how far-reaching their philosophy was, and yeah. So that's just the query because a lot of confusion goes around as to which religion is the best and which
Sure.
religion we ought to follow. And if even if we are following any particular religion, should we follow all what is written inside the religion or only those things which are humanitarian?
Those are very good questions as well. I mean, that's why I produced my map, the periodic table of the world's religions, right? So Judaism is these ones down the side, and there are many forms of Judaism. And Zoroastrianism are these purple ones here, different forms of it also, Mithraism and others. And we're going to come on and look at Christianity next, which is the blue ones. And we're going to look at Islam, which is the green ones here. So what I'm trying to do is I'm suspending judgment on which is the best. You know, I'll wait till I meet God in the afterlife. He can say which is the best. I think there's good bits in all of them. There's good qualities that Abraham, Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, Rama, Krishna, Buddha, Mahavira, they all have good qualities. And then they all have off days. They've all done things that probably they would look back on and regret. Like, for instance, we know that Abraham once, when he went into Egypt with his wife, Sarah, he lied to the Pharaoh. He said she was just his sister. He lied. He said, no, no, that's not my wife, that's my sister. And the Pharaoh fell in love with Sarah, this is in the Bible, and fancied her and tried to seduce her. And then Sarah herself said, no, 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 you can't, because I'm Abraham's wife. And the Pharaoh got really angry, quite rightly, and said to Abraham, look, how dare you lie to me like that? You made me fall in love with this woman, and she's your wife. Go, leave my country. And Abraham had to leave. Now, that seems to be a true story. And the reason Abraham gave for lying was he was afraid that if he'd confessed that Sarah was his wife, the Pharaoh would have killed him and stolen his wife, because that's what you did. You conquered someone, killed them, stole their woman. They were primitive people in those days, right? And so he lied. He pretended, no, it's only my sister. So he acted out of fear. So again, we come to the conclusion Abraham wasn't perfect. He was very human. You know, many people might have done that trick, pretending your girlfriend isn't your girlfriend, just because you don't want to get beaten up in the nightclub. You know, I can imagine that's going on all over the place. But so it's the very humanity of the Bible. That's why it's such a popular book, because it speaks to human beings as we are, not as we ought to be in our perfect form. You know, to follow the Buddha's way, you have to be like a superhuman, perfect kind of guy. Never go into a nightclub. And to be a Jain, you have to be so superhuman, you're almost from another planet. Whereas the Bible is written for everybody, ordinary people. Anyway, can I move on to the next one? Have we got, can I go on to the next two?
Yes, yes, sure.
Okay. Right, so this is really exciting. I mean, this is a rock and roll through these religions. They're extraordinary, but, and I wish, you know, I could spend like a whole MA course on each one of these. So this is a really condensed form, okay. Now we come to Christianity. This is very interesting, this bit. So one of the things I should have said earlier, but I'm saying it now, is that Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism. Some of the things in the Bible was written down after the Jews had been conquered in Jerusalem by Babylonian Assyrians, who were pretty strong pagans who didn't like the Jews at all. They conquered them and made them go into exile in Babylon, which was their capital. And they stayed there for quite a long time, and they learned all the legends of the local people. So Adam and Eve, the Noah flood story, all that was written down when they were in exile in Babylon, and they borrowed stories from the locals. Then along came the Persians, who historically liked the Jews because they were the enemy of their enemies. The Persians conquered the Babylonians and set the Jews free to go back to Jerusalem and refound their capital and their country. This is all in the Bible. So, so Judaism was strongly tinged by Zoroastrian beliefs at this point. And that's why you have in the Bible, you have the devil appears. Satan starts to be important. He's there important in Genesis. He's responsible for the fall of man. He tempts Eve to eat the wrong tree in the garden. We all probably know the story. And mankind's been paying a penalty ever since. So the devil is the baddie in the Bible. And the Jews saw themselves as a people, as being the good people of history who are fighting the devil, which is an idea they pinched or borrowed from the Zoroastrians, in fact. I don't think that idea was there before the exile. This is what biblical scholars say. I'm just summing up thousands of hours of scholarship here. So at the time of, whenever the Jews lost in war, they were constantly being invaded. They got on quite well with Alexander the Great. He never bothered to conquer Jerusalem. They accepted his overlordship. He was like a supreme commander-in-chief of the whole empire. And they used his visit to clobber another branch of Judaism called the Samaritans. So the temple priest of Jerusalem went to see Alexander and said, please send us some troops. We want to attack those other Jews who aren't real Jews. So there was even intertribal warfare going on among who was a proper Jew or not, right? And they did a deal with the Alexandrian people, but then there was a breakaway. They wanted a separate state, and the Maccabees revolted against Alexander's successors and created an independent little country called Judea. And that survived for 100 years or so. And then the Romans turned up, and the Romans, with their super army, conquered the whole thing and absorbed the Jewish people into their empire. And this is the background to how Christianity emerged. I'm just trying to give you the background. Where does this religion, Christianity, come from? There were many people in the Jewish community, resistance leaders, who said we should fight the Romans. They worship devils, they're always drunk, they're promiscuous, they have orgies, they have slaves, they're not good people, we should fight them. And there were heroic guerrillas who went off into the hills and tried to fight the Romans, but the Romans were unbeatable. They were a hugely disciplined army and they couldn't defeat them. So then this young boy grew up in the north of Israel in a place called Galilee, which is a beautiful lake. I've been there. It's absolutely to die for place. Galilee was quite sophisticated intellectually. It had currents from Greek thought. It had currents from ancient Canaanite thought. They worshipped the goddess traditions. The lake had been sacred to Atargatis, who was the goddess of fish and fertility and love. Jesus was obviously a precocious boy. The texts say that he was very, very intelligent. His parents, Mary and Joseph, probably had links to Egypt, where there was the leading intellectual class of Jews were living in Alexandria. They translated the Bible into Greek by then. They were discussing with Greek philosophers what this Bible meant. And they decided, a man called Philo, who was a Platonist, decided you could make sense of the Bible from a Platonic allegorical format. So Moses, yeah, it doesn't really matter when he existed. He was a heroic figure who led people to safety and liberation. And that's why he's important, said Philo. So Jesus grew up in this world of I think we know he spent time in Egypt as a boy. His father, Joseph, had links to Egypt. And they took him there to escape Herod when he was trying to kill all the babies in Bethlehem. Probably Jesus went back to Alexandria for his part of his, what you call higher education, because that's where you went if you were a clever Jew in those days. He would have learned biblical studies very, very deeply, and he would have learned philosophy. So his teaching was very much like Philo's. It was that you shouldn't worry about the letter of the Bible. You should worry about the spirit. You should get your spirit focused on the inner meaning of these texts and then live them. You should be under the guidance of the Shekinah, the Holy Spirit, as he called it, and live a righteous and pure life. And he did teach peace. He taught nonviolence. He was like the Buddha of the Jews, if you want. He said, stop all this killing. I don't care if you're a Roman or a Jew or a Samaritan or a Greek. Let's put the swords down. Let's study the laws of love. You know, we all know that if I hurt you or your family, you're going to come after me and hurt me. So let's not hurt each other. Let's practice the law of love. And he started teaching this in the north of Galilee. And he just assembled a group of disciples. We know the names: Peter, Thomas, John, and so on. They're all historical figures, I think. They weren't, they were people of faith, people of understanding. In Greek, in the New Testament, they're called the mathematici, which is the mathematical students, because the term mathematics was learning. We think of maths as like numbers and algebra and all that. Actually, in ancient Greek, it just meant learning or knowledge or study. So his mathematici were his students. And obviously, he was a very advanced teacher, from what we know. He started teaching about the age of 30. So he'd had all those years of learning Some say he studied with the Essenes, others say in Egypt. Some even have him going to India to study at Takshila, the great Buddhist monastery. And there were trade routes between Galilee and Takshila, where they were teaching Mahayana Buddhism by then. And some people have written books saying, no, Jesus must have spent a year or two in Takshila, because what he's teaching is like pure Mahayana co-enlightenment teachings and non-violence. It's possible. Anyway, he then, after teaching for about 3 years, he was going to Jerusalem to teach. But unfortunately, the system, the priesthood who controlled the temple in Jerusalem didn't like his teaching. This thing of non-violence, this thing of love, this was a heresy to them. It was dangerous. This idea of universalism, inclusivism, that you could worship the one God who was, whether you were Jewish or Greek or Roman, or even a woman. You know, I mean, Jesus was teaching women on equal terms to men. We know his closest student, Mary Magdalene, was an important figure. And other women were his disciples. Now, again, that broke the kind of rules of male patriarchy. So for many reasons, the Jews decided he had to go in collusion with the Roman authorities. So they went to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and said, this man is a heretic. We want him tried and we want him killed. Pontius Pilate examined him. They had him arrested at night. One of his disciples, Judas, betrayed him, it said, and he was examined. But the fact was that Pontius Pilate said, no, I can't find anything that he's done that's wrong. You know, he's just teaching slightly, he's teaching what he thinks is the truth. How is that a heresy? But unfortunately, the Jewish and no doubt some of the Romans decided that they had to make an example of him. And therefore they demanded the death penalty. I mean, scholars, biblical scholars are still working on all the timeline. The four Gospels, which is how we know a lot of this, don't give a consistent narrative. They seem to contradict each other. But the general pattern of what I'm saying is, I think, established that he was then crucified, which was the punishment they reserved for criminals. And he was crucified at a place called Golgotha, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. And if that's all that happened, there'd be no such thing as Christianity. Okay, so the Romans crucified thousands of Jewish rebels. I mean, it's unusual they killed someone who was non-violent. Normally they killed the violent ones. Obviously, it was an unfair sentence. It was unjust. And his disciples were very upset. It's like as if, imagine Mahavira or Buddha had been crucified, you know, they'd be extremely upset. And so they gathered, they were afraid, they didn't know what was happening. And then something miraculous happened. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb where Jesus' body had been put and found it empty. And then she reported seeing the risen Christ, like he'd come back from the dead. Now, what on earth, you know, she rushed back to the other disciples and said, come, look, I've found the risen Christ. And they couldn't believe her. They said, you must be crazy. You're a woman. You making up stories, you know. But then they also met the risen Christ. He appeared in gatherings of these disciples. Now, something strange had happened, and biblical scholars are still trying to work out what happened. I've set up a Mary Magdalene Studies Society to try and find out what happened, because I reckon she would be the key witness. There are different opinions. Some say there was no resurrection. All this is made up by the disciples of Jesus to pretend he'd risen, just to cause trouble with the Romans. Others say that he'd not been properly dead on the cross, that he'd been brought down prematurely and was revived by their medical knowledge. And because he was an advanced yogi who had mastery over his body, he'd survived that near-death experience. So it was like a near-death experience. And then Mary Magdalene and others had managed to revive him. which I think of all the possible explanations, I think that is the most likely myself, that he was not fully dead in the clinical way we would now say. He'd had a near-death experience and was revived, because he was brought down early from the cross. That seems to be the case. Anyway, there are all kinds of mysteries. We don't know fully how that happened, that resurrection, but something happened, because without that, there wouldn't have been a Christian church. And the disciples were encouraged. Mary Magdalene played a key role, so did John, so did Peter, and so on. And for them, it was a symbolic thing that the spirit of truth and non-violence and peace triumphed through that resurrection over the spirit of evil, silencing, using state violence to silence philosophers. So it was a huge moment in history, say some thinkers, that it was a symbolic moment at which the powers of good, let's go back to the Ahura Mazda theory of the Zoroastrians, the powers of good, Ahura Mazda, concentrated in the person of Jesus and managed to defeat Satan through his sacrificial, non-violent teachings. He survived and triumphed. And the church triumphant then took those teachings forward and said, our man, Jesus, wasn't just a normal man. This was the Son of God. This was the son of Ahura Mazda, come to be with us to bring this liberation from evil and death and Satan. And if you become a Christian, right, you're baptized, you join the forces of light and truth and goodness, which are now universal for everybody. They're open to all. You don't have to become a Zoroastrian or a Jew or anything else. You can still be that, but you can also join the army of truth and love and peace and become a Christian. And that idea spread, okay. And in the first few centuries, it was very strong on non-violence and non-killing. The Christians said, we will not kill, we will not join anyone's armies. The Jews and the Romans then had a huge war after about 60 years after Christ's death. He predicted this. He said, look, my brothers and sisters, please don't fight, don't kill each other. But after he died, the Jews did a material military revolt against the Romans in 66, approximately AD. And the Roman army came with huge legions and they fought endless battles. They fought and they captured Jerusalem after a siege of some years. And the Romans acted abysmally. They crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem Jews they captured in the countryside. They crucified, according to Josephus, 100,000 Jews in front of the besieged city of Jerusalem to shock the people into surrendering. They said, look, we'll stop doing these crucifixions if you surrender. And the Jews refused. Josephus wrote the history of this war. He was a Jewish historian who spoke Greek, and he eventually joined the Roman side. He'd been part of the Jewish army in Galilee, but then he joined the Roman side, and he wrote about Jesus. So we know, he's a very important source. So anyway, the Christians didn't take part in that war, either on the Roman side or the Jewish side. They eventually, I think what happened, the Roman Empire became more and more corrupt. I mean, there's many things about the Romans I love, the language, Latin, the culture they brought, there's many good things, the Greek philosophical schools and so on. But the emperors were very corrupt. They were given to orgies of sadomasochism. The Emperor Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, these were some of the most evil people that have ever lived. And they would, I won't go into all the details, but trust me, they were pretty evil. And they started persecuting the Christians because the Christians were saying, no, this is wrong. You shouldn't act like this. You shouldn't be killing your wife and sleeping with your stable boy and then killing him and then burning the bodies of Christians. They were doing evil stuff, right? I mean, you name it, it was being done by them. And so the Christians stood against them. non-violently. And those are the age of the saints. They just used prayer. Eventually, in 315, an Emperor Constantine came to the throne, who accepted the right of Christians to have equality and stopped the persecutions. For those 300 years, they'd been persecuted, but they never fought back. This is the extraordinary thing. But the trouble was, it was a good and a bad thing, because after Christianity became the official religion of the empire, the Christians then compromised and then joined the armies and said, okay, we'll join the fighting forces. Now you're a Christian emperor, we'll be good Christian soldiers. So, but the empire didn't change all its spots. There were still wicked people doing corrupt things. But now, because they were Christian, they said, well, we'll get away with it now, you know. So the whole history of later Christianity, as it compromised with the imperial powers, used violence and pretended it was in the cause of righteousness. So when the British invaded India, they didn't come just with like prayer and non-violence. They came with armies. And when Gandhi said to them, we want non-violence, please, they said, well, we're putting you in prison. This is dangerous heresy. So I don't think, you know, the trouble was Christianity didn't live up to its own teachings. I'm sure Christ himself would have got on very well with Gandhi and would have agreed with him. But the British Empire had compromised and become a military force with corruption. And we know what happened to the Amritsar massacre and so on. The kind of thinking of these British generals that they could kill a few hundred Sikhs just to teach a lesson to the Indians. That's corrupt Christianity, not the real thing. So we're suffering from the consequences of that, you know. However, there have been voices in Christianity, the Quakers, there's been a tradition of non-violence, which I was associated with, speaking out against this corruption, saying, let's go back to the real teachings of Christ, you know, and Buddha and all the proper non-violent teachers. Okay, so and that's where we are, where there's this struggle between this corrupt, let's use force and violence and call it Christianity, or let's not do that. Let's use wisdom and non-violence. It's a struggle within the Christian community, within Europe, within Britain, and so on. Right, so now we come to our last one today, which is Islam. And this is, again, a very important story. I'll move straight on to it rather than have questions now. We'll wait for the end, okay? So Islam owes its existence really to the life of another prophet called Muhammad, who grew up in Mecca in the 7th century. He was born in like the 577, I think, and lived to the 629, 630, something like that. So it was 600 years after Jesus, right? Now, in Arabia, there were some Christians in the desert, but they were called Gnostics. The Gnostic Christians didn't like the empire. They didn't like what had happened to Christianity. It had become a force for justifying imperialism, just like the Persian Empire had done. They said these Christians in Byzantium, which was the capital, are corrupt. They go around conquering people, saying they're doing it in the name of Christ. They build big churches and stick up mosaics of Jesus on the ceiling. But actually, they're just acting in a corrupt way. You know, they're killing each other. There's rival gangs for power. There's corruption everywhere you look. So they went off in the desert and said, no, we don't want anything to do with this. We're Gnostic Christians. We follow the true Christ, who was a great prophet, a great teacher, and we are looking for him to inspire us. Now, there was a whole tradition of these desert Christians in the Arabian world. And Khadija, who was a very rich merchant in Mecca, was one of them. And her cousin, Waraka, was one of these Gnostic Christians. And they had like a little, what we call a house church, where they used to meet in Mecca. And they would pray to the God of Jesus and the God of Abraham and the God of Moses. They wanted peace for all mankind. between the religions. They wanted to get back to the original one God that they believe Christ taught, but so had Moses, so had Abraham. They weren't very learned people. They didn't, they'd never heard of Plato or Aristotle or Lao Tzu or Confucius, but they were learned within their time frame. They were literate in that they could read. It's thought that this little house church in Mecca probably had a Gospel of Matthew. They had some of the Gospels, some of the stories. And the crucial, important thing to know about Islam is that that woman, Khadija, really is the founder of it, because she adopted Muhammad. Muhammad went to work for her company, which is a trading company, and she put him in charge of the camel trains, which were going all over the Middle East from Mecca. Some would go northeast to a place called Hira. Hira was a very big city. It was in southern Iraq, and it had Zoroastrians, it had Manichaeans, which was another sort of Gnostic Christian tradition. It had real Christians, it had Jews, it was a cosmopolitan intellectual city like Varanasi or somewhere. And Muhammad took his camel trains there and was just in awe of it. Like, wow. He was learning orally. He couldn't read or write, but he would sit and listen to the stories. We know that he went to Damascus in the camel trains. And Damascus was another great cosmopolitan city. So he learned all these oral stories. I'm pretty sure he went to Sanlerfa because he loved Abraham so much. That was his hero. He would have gone to Sanlerfa, which is just up the road from Damascus. He probably also went south to Yemen. After a few years, Khadija basically and him fell in love. She was older than him, about 10 years older. But it was a true love story because Muhammad was a very good man. He was very trustworthy. You gave him, some goods to go and sell in Hira, and he'd come back and not cheat you. He was a very honorable man, called the trustworthy one, Al-Alamin. And Khadija loved him, and they got married, and became like we call it a super couple, a power couple, if you want. And they're the origin of Islam. And Muhammad matured. For 15 years, he was married to Khadija, working with her and studying, thinking. He was obviously a deep man. He had a sort of deep heart. He was asking himself, how can we get peace on this planet when all these different religions are coexisting? There's Christians of different sects saying one thing or another. There's the different Jews, they're all saying one thing or another. They don't talk to each other. Then you've got the Zoroastrians that he's met in Hira, they're saying a different thing. Well, what's God saying in all this? And then there's the pagan Arabs who worship the sun and the moon and, other things. What's God actually saying here? So he used to go off alone into the mountains to meditate. He did a sort of retreat. And it was then, and he was asking, what can I do to help this humanity heal and become unified? And that's when he believed that he was inspired by the angel Gabriel, because he believed in the sort of Christian Gnostic worldview of angels and so on, and God and the devil, the whole story. And Archangel Gabriel came to him and said, Muhammad, listen carefully. I'm going to be sending you a message for all mankind. Go back to Mecca and repeat what I say. And that became the first verse, the first chapter of the Quran. Because Muhammad went down, he told his wife first, Khadija, said, look, I've just met an angel in the cave who told me this thing. Am I mad? Am I crazy? What's happening? Am I having a psychotic breakdown? And Khadija took him to Waraka, her cousin. They told him the whole story, and Waraka said, no, he's not going crazy. I think he might be the next prophet we've all been waiting for. Just watch this space, carry on. And so it gradually evolved over the next few years. Muhammad got more messages. And if you study them and read them, they are very, very beautiful. They're in Arabic. He didn't write them, but he told his students them and they wrote them down. And that became what's called the Quran, which Muslims believe came from God through Muhammad. And I think, I think I've just finished a detailed commentary on the Quran. It's taken me 10 years of study, going into every line, every word. I think we would have to say that this comes from the spiritual source of intelligence, divine intelligence. It's not coming from Muhammad's ego. Some of these verses and these words, they're so profound, so beautiful, so deep. We have to say they're coming from what Jung would call the collective unconscious, if you want. But they're filtered through the cultural matrix in which he was thinking. So they're filtered through the mind of Muhammad. And as that happens, they pick up the cultural trappings of Muhammad's time and place. So they come out with formulations that are Gnostic Christian, that are Zoroastrian, that are some pagan Arab thoughts. And what I've done in my commentary, and it's the first time it's ever been done, no scholars have attempted this before, I've tried to differentiate between what is the divine message here and where that comes from, and the sort of cultural trappings in which it's delivered through Muhammad's mind, which was obviously just a normal mind. And Muslims don't say he was a superhuman. He was a normal guy like you or me. And therefore he had his failings. Now, the question you're going to ask me is, what was the teaching about violence, peace? Okay. So during the time these revelations were coming in Mecca, when he was married to Khadija, they were all non-violent. He told his followers, which were growing in number, not to fight. That wasn't the point. Islam, the word he used, means surrender to God, to the absolute. So if I surrender to the absolute, I'm going to trust in God to protect me. And if you come to attack me with swords, God will somehow protect me. That's what those early Muslims believed. And they experienced the protection of the divine. They had miracles like happening every day. It was a magical time for them. And Khadija was like supporting this whole thing. She made it all possible through her wealth. She was one of the wealthiest people in Mecca. What then happened is that Khadija tragically died. It's a sad story. I mean, she was older than Muhammad. We knew she was going to die, but she died like too early, I think. Then the people that didn't like Muhammad in Mecca started persecuting him. They started beating up his followers. He would walk down the street and they would spit on him. The boys of the enemy would throw stones at him. They would shout, "Crazy prophet, hearing voices, silly man," and chuck stones. Now, none of that happened when Khadija was alive because she'd protected him. She was like the queen bee of Mecca. But after she'd gone, his protection had gone. And it got nasty. They were quite violent. So Muhammad didn't teach fight back. He said no. He told most of his followers to go to Ethiopia and take refuge at the court of the king of Ethiopia for protection. Like, rather than fight back, just leave Mecca. His sermons, his teachings in the Quran became more strong. Like, God was very angry at this and saying these people will be punished. But he was fighting on a spiritual level. Eventually, it got to a climax. The pagan Muslims saw what Muhammad was doing, bringing in this idea of one God as a direct threat of their monopoly of Mecca. Because their Kaaba, their temple, had idols of all the gods of all of Arabia. Each tribe throughout Arabia had an idol in Mecca. And they would come and trade and have festivals for their gods. And they were pagans. They had many gods and goddesses. And the pagan Meccans said, look, if this Muhammad's religion takes on, this monotheistic idea, we'll have to shut the Kaaba. We'll have to get rid of all our statues. The traders won't come. The pilgrims won't come. He's a threat to our whole way of life. So let's silence him. And some said, let's kill him. The best way is to kill him. They gave him 3 warnings. Stop your preaching of religion. Stop this Quran nonsense. Admit it, you made it all up. And we'll carry on. Otherwise, that's your final warning. So he knew that his life was in danger. And he decided with his closest disciple called Ali, who was his uncle's son. He'd brought him up with him, his cousin really, and Ali had married his daughter Fatima with Khadija. They were like a really close family. Ali said, "Look, Muhammad, you leave tonight. You go with Abu Bakr. We'll put some camels in the cave. You can go and run. I will stay in your bed and pretend to be you. And when they burst in, they'll see that there's somebody there. But then I'll jump up and say, it's not Muhammad, it's me." And you can escape by then, right? And that shows the love that Ali had for Muhammad. And he did that. And the plot succeeded. Muhammad escaped with his other trusted friend, Abu Bakr. They got away to the hills, and Ali stayed to cover his back. And when they burst in, they realized that Muhammad had fled. And they didn't kill Ali because he wasn't the one. They then went off in a pursuit of Muhammad. They traveled into the mountains trying to find his trail, and they were good trackers. And they came to the cave where he was hiding with Abu Bakr. And this is a miracle, the Muslims say, is a great proof that he was divinely chosen. A spider had covered the entrance to the cave with a web. Just in the few hours they'd been hiding in there. And when the Arab pagan force arrived, one of them saw this spider's web and said, "Oh, he can't be in there. Look, there's a spider's web here. If he'd been in there, it wouldn't, be broken. So let's not bother to go in." And that's how Muhammad survived, with the thank you from the spider representing God protecting him. And later, there's a wonderful verses in the Quran about how the spider is to be praised, its genius and so on, and proof of God's existence. Something that tiny can make things that complicated and magical as a spider's web. So God is just like the greatest of all things to create such life. Anyway, he then escaped to Medina, which was a neighboring city about 80 miles away. And his other followers escaped too. They came gradually, each night a few more. The ones from Ethiopia came back and joined him. And he started a community in Medina. And the people of Medina welcomed him. They said, "Yes, you can come and live among us." And they said, he promised to be peaceful, obviously. And they said, "Well, any mediations that we need will come to you." He was famous for being just and fair in his dealings. And like all people, they had quarrels, people fell out, So they would go to Muhammad as their mediator. The trouble was, and this is where the war starts, is the people of Mecca didn't accept that Muhammad had got away and that he was still teaching his new religion, which they thought was a heresy, in Medina, which was another city. And so they sent armies to come and get him. A long story. And at this point, Muhammad gave the signal, or God through the Quran gave the signal, it's okay for a Muslim to defend himself using force. The Muslim wasn't supposed to attack, but if someone attacks you, you can defend yourself. And that's how the law was to begin with in Islam. That's the ideal of the true Islamic warrior. You can fight in self-defense if someone's trying to kill you, but there were limits to that. So you couldn't kill women, you couldn't kill somebody if they weren't attacking you, you couldn't kill innocent people. There were very strict laws laid down for the Islamic war, which they called jihad, which was holy war, and it was only ever in self-defense. Did Muhammad himself stray from that? Yes. The trouble was, towards the end of his life, as I've documented in my commentary on the Quran, as he became more powerful and won more battles, I think what happened is what happens to all powerful patriarchal male figures. He became less cautious about ethics. For instance, he started having lots of wives. When he conquered some force, he would choose the most beautiful woman and capture her and turn her into a slave wife. It was okay to have slave women as your wives. But he also he would marry other warrior bands, chiefs' daughters for diplomacy, to make like a peace pact. So he became a wheeler and dealer of normal power politics in the so-called real world. And his forces became very powerful. Nobody could defeat them. And, in the last few years of his life, he led armies up to attack the Byzantine Empire. I mean, that's huge. He's now attacking an empire because he thought he was chosen by God as the prophet and had the right to lead these forces because they were the true forces. So he looked to Abraham as his mentor, and he believed he was bringing a reform in. He was saying, let's go back to the original true monotheism of Abraham. But unfortunately, as we've seen, Abraham was a warrior. So that meant that Abraham gave him the green light to be like a tribal war leader as well. And so in a nutshell, as Islam, from its pure roots, which I've documented in my commentary on the Quran, from its original non-violence, especially when his wife died, it gradually accepted more and more, we can call it righteous violence, that it was spreading the truth through the sword. And if you stood up against it, the first few caliphs after Muhammad died were pretty strong war leaders. And they put out that if you opposed the Muslim armies, you could be killed. No negotiation, surrender or die was the message. Because some Arabians didn't like this. They said, no, we want to go on following our old customs. We don't mind Muhammad, but he's gone now. We want to go on being pagan Arabs. And the Caliph said, no, you can't. This Islam is forever, changed everything. And so there was a war of rebellion, and they conquered it. The Muslims just wiped them out and converted them to Islam or death. So, and then just to finish, we're coming to the end here. Islam split into two rivers, let's say, the Shia and the Sunni. You see, Ali, who'd been with him all the way through, I think was the wisest of all Muhammad's disciples. He was the closest to him. He knew what he really wanted right from the beginning. And Ali was very strict on non-violence, is the real ideal of Islam. He wanted the pure Islam to prevail. And there's a wonderful story. He was a great warrior. He was the most fierce warrior of Muhammad's armies. But he always insisted on sticking to the rules, right? There's a famous incident when, in a battle, Ali was fighting with the enemy, the pagan, and the pagan guy dropped his sword. And Ali said, okay, he sheathed his sword and said, now go and pick yours back up again. And the pagan said, what are you talking about? You can kill me, you won. And Ali said, no, I can't, I'm not allowed to do that. I can't kill an unarmed man. Yeah, but surely the whole point is we're trying to kill each other here. Like, what are you talking about? No, I'm defending myself because I'm surrendered to God. I believe in Islam and peace and purity. You're trying to kill me, so I'm defending myself. And if I have to, I'll kill you. But I'm not going to stain my soul by killing an unarmed man, because that's against God's law. So you must pick your sword up, and then we will resume. And yes, I will kill you if you keep attacking me. Anyway, the man was so impressed, he refused to pick his sword up. He retired from the battle. And a few days later, after discussing, he converted and became a Muslim. He said, this is surely the truth, this religion. Now that was Ali. That was Ali's example. And he was a very great man, I think, Muhammad's true successor. Unfortunately, after Muhammad died, he died too early to really succeed. The warlords took over power. The old bandits that used to run Mecca pretended to be Muslims, converted to this thing they called Islam. But it was hypocrisy. They saw it as a great trading opportunity. If we do what we're doing and we call ourselves Muslims, it'll bring all the pilgrims into Mecca and we can take all the cash when they come. So they created a sort of Islamic fake Islam. and they used violence to extend it. Now, Ali was opposed to all that. Ali said, no, that's not what Muhammad wanted. He wanted the true spiritual reformation of humanity in purity and love. But they kept passing him over to become the caliph or successor. They kept saying, no, Ali, you're an idealist. We're running an empire here. You can't be the leader. But on the fourth occasion, he was finally chosen, because by then he was the obvious choice. He was wise, kind, courteous, and he'd been married to Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, who he loved. So, unfortunately, and this is the tragedy of Islam, this story I'm telling you is a tragedy, right? The warlords controlling Syria and other provinces by then did not accept Ali's appointment as caliph. They raised rebellion armies against him, which was against all Islamic law, right? They said, we don't want this stupid idealist preacher type of guy teaching us what Islam is. We're very happy with our Islam. We go to the mosque, we do our prayers, and then we go and extend the empire with killing. That's what Islam is, and we get lots of booty. What's wrong with that? So they attacked Ali with armies. He won miraculously, sort of half won, but then they said, oh, we surrender. No, let's have mediation. Let's have a peace deal. He agreed to that. And to cut a long story short, he agreed to go and meet the rebel leader who was working for the Syrian governor, Muawiyah. And the deal was they'd only turn up with 40 people each, unarmed, at a particular place. And he did this. He kept the word. He turned up with 40 lightly armed people. The other guys brought an army. So he was very trusting, very naive. And the other guys killed him. Ali was then massacred. And this happened also to his sons and his sons' sons. They kept saying, we want true Islam of nonviolence. But the other guys didn't want it. And they wanted Islam as a violent force. So you have this split in Islam between the pure ones, who became known as the Shias. They're the dominant religion in Iran now, which was a very religious country, as we've seen. And a lot of the Zoroastrians accepted Shiism. They said Muhammad is the Session, and still do. The Shias did fight in the end. They had to fight back. And that's how they got their state in Persia. But their impulse is towards diplomacy and peace. And you can see that in the way the Iranians are still trying to talk to the Americans even now, and try and get some peace diplomacy going. And then to finish, there's a third type of Muslim who is the Sufi, who was like the spiritual seer, like the Buddhist or the sage, who doesn't fight under any circumstances, who is about spiritual transformation, true Islam. And in my commentary on the Quran, I put in largely a lot of Sufi insights and teachings, as I've studied with Sufis who teach this purified form of Islam. But they're few and far between. The average Muslim you'll meet in, downtown Riyadh is going to be still with the, like, let's have more missiles. They're even now killing each other. The Shias are being attacked in Yemen by Saudi bombers funded by Americans. So this is all war business as usual. It's not, So as we've seen, anyway, to finish, we've seen these two religions, Christian and Islam. They have both wings. They have the peace-loving, non-violent people, but they're in a minority. And the people that run the states, systems, the empires, have a much more like war business. It's a military economy they want to run. And the peace people are a threat to that. So they're usually often called heretics and they're stuck in jail. A lot of the Sufis have been martyrs over the years. So there we are. I hope that was interesting. It's a complex story, but I've tried to synthesize it down into a short talk.
Indeed, it was beautifully explained by you. I think you explained it in as simple words as you could. So I believe because we are covering a large topic and still we have to cover it in a short span of time.
Yeah,
So that's the minimum time I think
sure.
we can devote for it. Uh, yeah, so I was actually very much interested in the story, all the stories in fact, which we discussed, which you told us today. I'm sure everyone also enjoyed the session for today.
Mm,
So,
good.
if it's all right, then I would like to conclude the session for today. Or would you like
Absolutely.
to?
Do you have any final questions or comments about, say, the Islamic one? Because I know in India you've had a history, and you know, Islam conquered northern India, the Mughal dynasty, and so on. Um, were they? I think they were both. There were many, many great seers among the Indian Muslims,
So
Sufis.
they are both, I mean, there are every kind of Islamic people, like there are peaceful Islamic, even now there are peaceful Islamic leaders, but at the same time, the dominant ones are those who are pushing for violence. The ones who are talking about peace, they are silent, they are not much upfront in the socio-political system. And yes,
That's a,
Sufism was there, but it was there in around the 13th century, I believe, and it was there for a very short period. For now, I don't think Sufism is in existence.
oh. Well, I can't agree with that because I met many Sufis from India, and it was very influential. Um,
Yes,
you
but
know,
they're
but
not
it
to be seen anywhere prominently.
no, but that's the gift of the Sufi. The Sufi is invisible. They teach behind the scenes. Obviously, the media, television, internet websites, the whole, and the newspaper industry,
So, like for instance,
they're
I'll just
controlled by the military forces. So you won't get interviews with great Sufis in any of those sources because it's not in the interest of the media to give the good news. I mean, we have a sociological problem about the control of the media, but I assure you, the good Muslims, the true Sufis, the real seers, and I think Akbar was one, by the way, the great Mughal ruler Akbar. He wanted an India that combined Hindus, Jains, Muslims all in one. He called it the religion of light. You know, I'm a great lover of Akbar. I've been to the sites of the Mughal rulers, but they themselves were accused of heresy within. So that's
yes,
the problem. You know, if you're too peace loving, you get called a heretic.
yes, indeed, that's the biggest problem. Even right now, a lot of tensions relating to Muslim community keeps on happening. It's like an everyday story. Something or the other every time comes up.
Well, we're not going to be able to solve all the problems in this one
Like,
class, but
uh,
hopefully this course, if people listen to it and study with us, and we've got another session to go, then another couple of sessions, and gradually people will realize that we can choose the peace path within these religions. You don't have to stop being a Muslim or stop being a Hindu or stop being a Christian or stop being a Jew. But what you do have to do is like be a better one. Go back to the original idealism of Muhammad in his days with Khadija. And more scholars need to study that period. You know, it's been very neglected. In my commentary on the Quran, I'm the first, certainly the first Western academic to really say, let's look at this here, that 15-year period. That's true Islam. What happened later is like, you know, when the rocket goes slightly out of control. And the same with early Christianity, that Gnostic period is when the pure teachings of Jesus were there. Let's go back to that. And I think they're totally in harmony with the teachings of the great seers of India, Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu. You know. Anyway, that's my vision of peace. Let's carry on, eh?
yes, definitely. So we shall meet in the fourth session of ours the next
Good.
time.
Yeah. Right. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.